In a single year, China launched 1.421 new commercial ships. South Korea built 247. Japan, the country that practically reinvented modern shipbuilding in the 1960s, came in third, with about 100. The United States, which during World War II was producing more than half of all merchant tonnage on the planet, built about 5 large commercial vessels in 2025. 5. China's share of the world's new ship orders last year was 63%. America's share was 0.04%. Today the United States ranks 19th in global shipbuilding, behind Croatia. This is the story of how one of the most lopsided industrial transformations in modern history actually happened. Why the gap is now so wide that the United States cannot realistically close it for a generation. And how Washington is trying, through one of the most aggressive trade actions in 20 years, to claw a fraction of it back. Let's anchor the numbers, because the headline gap is so extreme it needs a moment to absorb. In 2025, Chinese shipyards signed contracts for 1.421 new commercial vessels. Together those ships measured 35.37 million compensated gross tons, the standardized unit shipbuilders used to compare hull complexity across container ships, oil tankers, bulk carriers, and the high-end liquefied natural gas carriers that cost $250 million apiece. Measured in compensated gross tons, China's market share landed at 63%. Measured the Chinese way, by deadweight tonnage, including order backlog, it's even higher. According to the country's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, China captured 67.3% of all new ship orders in the first 3 quarters of 2025. And 65.2% of the global order backlog. Now hold those numbers next to the rest of the world. South Korea, the country long seen as the gold standard of modern shipbuilding, home to Hyundai Heavy Industries, Samsung Heavy, and Hanwha Ocean, signed contracts for 247 vessels. About 21% of the global market by tonnage. Japan, the country that defined the post-war commercial fleet from Toyota tankers to Mitsubishi car carriers, came in third with roughly 5%, after orders collapsed by 53% year-over-year. And the United States? In 2024, the most recent year with cross-border data, the U.S. built 0.04% of the world's commercial ships. That's not 4%, it's 0.04%. The country that, in 1945, was producing more than half of the world's merchant tonnage, that built the Liberty ships that carried the Allies across the Atlantic, now ranks 19th in global shipbuilding output. Behind Croatia, behind Turkey, behind the Philippines. Across the past decade, the American average has been 0.24%, and it has been trending downward, not up. So you have a 63 to 0.04 gap. You have a single Chinese province, Jiangsu, that builds more commercial tonnage in a single quarter than the entire United States builds in a year. And you have an industrial imbalance so extreme that, even if America started rebuilding today, the gap would take more than a generation to close. To understand how the gap got this wide, you have to rewind to the year 2000. In 2000, China was a marginal player in commercial shipbuilding. South Korea and Japan together produced roughly 80% of the world's merchant tonnage. American yards still turned out occasional commercial hulls, mostly under the protection of the Jones Act, the 1920 law that requires ships moving cargo between U.S. ports to be built in American shipyards, owned by American companies, and crewed by American sailors. Then Beijing made a strategic decision: shipbuilding would become a national industry. On the scale of steel or rail, the vehicle was state-led. A sprawling enterprise eventually consolidated as China State Shipbuilding Corporation, CSSC, fused from 2 earlier state holdings to coordinate yards from Shanghai to Dalian. Subsidies poured in, direct grants, soft loans at near zero interest, industrial land at near zero cost, a captive domestic steel industry feeding the yards with the cheapest plate steel in the world, and a deep bench of low-cost engineering talent flowing in from China's universities. The big names emerge: Pudong Zonghua in Shanghai building gas carriers, Jiangnan Shipyard launching container ships and cruise vessels. Dalian Shipbuilding turning out tankers in serial production. By 2010, China had pulled even with Korea in completed tonnage. By 2015, China had overtaken Japan. By 2020, China was the undisputed number one in every metric shipbuilders track: orders, deliveries, and backlog. And in the early 2020s, two trends supercharged the lead. The first was a global fleet renewal cycle. Thousands of aging container ships and tankers ordered during the post-2008 commodities boom were hitting retirement age. All at roughly the same time. The replacement orders were enormous. The second trend was technological. Chinese yards moved up the value ladder, taking on liquefied natural gas carriers, the high-value, high-complexity ships that Korean yards had previously owned almost alone. By 2024, China was building 70% of every new commercial vessel ordered worldwide. The buildup wasn't recent. It wasn't a surprise. It was a 20-year national project that the rest of the world mostly didn't react to until the U.S. Trade Representative published its January 2025 finding declaring China's maritime dominance unreasonable. By then, the Western yards that could have responded had, for the most part, already closed. The American shipbuilding story is the mirror image. It is not a tale of falling behind. It is a tale of methodically forgetting how. In 1945, the United States launched more than 5.500 merchant vessels in a single year. American yards built roughly 70% of the global commercial fleet during World War II. Liberty ships, Victory ships, T2 tankers, all turned out in numbers that even today seem hard to believe. Through the 1950s and into the 60s, U.S. yards still produced hundreds of tankers and bulk carriers annually. Then Japan modernized. By the 1970s, U.S. commercial output had collapsed to a niche. By the 1980s, Korea joined Japan as a low-cost competitor, and by the year 2000, fewer than 10 American yards still built ocean-going merchant ships. Today, the United States builds, on average, around 5 large commercial vessels per year. That number doesn't include Navy ships, which are a separate ecosystem subsidized by Department of Defense contracts. For commercial output, the U.S. share globally is 0.04%. Behind Vietnam, behind the Philippines, behind Croatia, behind Turkey. The Cato Institute, no fan of protectionism, calculates that when American yards do produce a large commercial vessel, typically under the Jones Act, it sells at 4 to 5 times the global market price. A container ship that costs around $90 million in China sells for $350 to $450 million in the United States. That price premium isn't paid by Beijing. It's paid by American shippers, American ports, and ultimately American consumers in the form of higher transport costs baked into everything from gasoline to groceries. There's a national security shadow over all of this too. The same Chinese yards that turn out tens of thousands of merchant ships also build the People's Liberation Army Navy, which, by 2025, had surpassed the U.S. Navy in total hull count, with more than 370 warships to America's 295. The industrial base, the welders, naval architects, steel rolling capacity, dry dock capacity, is the same for both. China didn't choose between commercial and military shipbuilding. It scaled both. On a shared foundation, the United States chose, by default, neither. And trying to rebuild that foundation from a 0.04% starting point is what the next phase of this story is about. On January 20, 2025, the U.S. Trade Representative completed a Section 301 investigation that had been initiated under the prior administration. After a petition filed by 5 American unions, the ruling found that China's targeting of the maritime, logistics, and shipbuilding sectors for dominance was unreasonable and that it burdened U.S. commerce. That ruling cleared the legal path for retaliation. 3 months later, on April 17, 2025, the Trump administration's USTR announced the actions. They were sweeping. Beginning October 14, 2025, any vessel built in China that calls at a U.S. port now pays a fee. Initially, it's $50 per net ton, meaning a typical mid-sized Chinese-built container ship of around 50.000 net tons faces a $2.5 million surcharge every time it docks in an American port. the fees escalate. On April 17, 2026, the rate jumps to $80 per net ton. On April 17, 2027, it rises again to $110. For Chinese-operated vessels, meaning ships flown under a Chinese flag or owned by a Chinese company. Even if they were built elsewhere, the structure is different. But the ceiling is steep, up to $1 million per U.S. port call. For Chinese-built vessels, the ceiling reaches $1.5 million per call. Layered on top is a new rule that, over time, a rising percentage of U.S. liquefied natural gas exports must be carried on U.S.-built LNG tankers. Given that the U.S. has built almost no large LNG tankers in modern times, that pipeline is essentially empty. The rule functions as a forced investment signal. Build it domestically, or lose the cargo. The effect on China's order book was visible almost immediately. Global market share for new Chinese orders fell from 70% in 2024 to 63% in 2025. The first such drop in 5 years. Korean shipyards absorbed most of the slippage, especially in the LNG segment, where Hyundai Heavy and Samsung Heavy already have the technical edge. But here is the catch. The absolute size of China's lead remains so wide that a 7-point drop barely registers as a dent. To get below 50% market share, China would have to lose another 12 points. To get below 25%, it would have to lose another 40. Neither happens in a hurry. And while the fees impose real costs on American importers in the short term, they do nothing on their own to actually build a shipyard or train a welder. So why does this gap actually matter outside of shipping trade journals? Because shipping is the circulatory system of the global economy. About 80% of all international trade, by volume, moves on ships. Every container of laptops, every barrel of crude oil, every iron ore cargo, every grain shipment, every wind turbine blade, every car ultimately rides on a hull built in some shipyard. Somewhere. When more than 60% of the world's new hulls come out of one country's yards. That country effectively controls the replacement cycle of the global shipping fleet. If global tensions escalate, if a Taiwan Strait crisis disrupts shipping lanes, if sanctions slow commerce, if a major fleet operator is forced to retire ships faster than planned, the world physically cannot rebuild lost tonnage without going back through Chinese yards. South Korea, the only competitor with serious scale, builds roughly 1/3 of what China does. And Korean yards are themselves dependent on Chinese steel and Chinese-made components for many vessel classes. There's also a quieter economic angle. Chinese yards aren't just cheap. They've climbed the technology ladder. The newest LNG carriers, the most technically demanding commercial ships in the world, carrying liquefied gas at -162 degrees Celsius, are now being built at Hudong Zhonghua, Zhongnan, and other Chinese yards at roughly Korean quality. At lower prices, the premium tier of shipbuilding is no longer a Korean monopoly. Meanwhile, the United States is trying to rebuild from the foundation up. The Trump administration's stated goal is to revive American commercial shipbuilding to capture at least 1% of global output within 10 years, 25 times today's level. Private equity firms have started acquiring Jones Act yards, betting that subsidies and tariffs will reshape the economics. Some Korean shipbuilders, notably Hanwha Ocean, have proposed joint ventures with U.S. yards, transferring design and welding know-how. But none of this happens fast. Building a modern shipyard is a 5 to 10-year project. Training a generation of welders, naval architects, supervisors, and project managers is another 5 to 10. And meanwhile, China keeps launching ships, roughly 4 every single day. The gap is not closing. For now, it is simply being acknowledged. 63% of the world's hulls built in one country, 0.04% in another. If this kind of data story is useful to you, subscribe. Asia by the numbers. One big economic shift at a time.